Hello and welcome to Empathy at the Table. My name is Tony Anagor. I'm the founder of the Institute of Leadership and Negotiation. And every week I sit down with some of the world's leading thinkers and practitioners to explore leadership, negotiation, and the conversations that shape our lives on a daily basis. Today's episode is a little different because I'm actually welcoming back a returning guest. Joshua Weiss first joined me on episode 48. In episode 48, we explored the ideas behind his book, Getting Back to the Table, and what negotiation can teach us about recovering from setbacks and repairing relationships. Since then, Josh's work has continued to evolve. He's launched a new exciting initiative called Negotiation Stories. And I really like this because it's built around one simple and very powerful idea that some of our greatest lessons that we learn as negotiators don't come from the textbooks or from theory or frameworks, but they come from real world experiences and people willing to share their stories with others. And in this conversation, we revisit some of the themes from our first discussion, but we also explore why stories are so powerful and what they've revealed about negotiations. And essentially why becoming a better negotiator relies on starting with becoming a better learner. And I hope you enjoy this conversation with Josh Weiss. And if you do, please don't forget to give us a like and make sure you follow us. Guess who's here? Well, I'm here with, I'd like to call him a good friend now. I feel I've got to know him. I've got to know his material and the work that he's doing. And I think he's doing some great work. So I'm really pleased to welcome back into the studio, Mr. Josh Weiss. Thank you, Josh. Thank you for joining us again on Empathy at the Table today.
Thank you, Tony. And it would be an honor and a pleasure to be known as your friend. So
excellent. Well, actually, I'm in Boston I think in September. I'm going to be in New York, and I'm taking a quick trip over to Boston.
All
so
right.
I'll let you know the dates, and if you're available, it really would be nice to actually catch up face to face.
That would be great. I would love that.
Great. So I'm with the podcast, I do my guests come every 2 weeks. So the show comes out every couple of weeks, and I'm now on episode 75. You were episode 48.
Wow.
So
okay.
A lot's happened between 48 and 75.
That's for sure.
Yeah. So why don't you bring us up to speed? Firstly, for the guests who maybe are new to you for the first time, a little bit about your background and your interest in negotiation and your specific interest, which is, the conflict, bringing people back to the table, which I really like. Maybe you can share a little bit about that, and then we can do a deep dive into what's really cooking.
Yeah. So I'll share the sort of three buckets of things that I currently do, and then sort of talk a little bit about the bigger picture. So the first thing that I do is I run a master's degree program at a smaller university called Bay Path University. It's actually, the name is changing to a Master's of Science in Conflict Resolution and Negotiation from an organizational leadership and negotiation perspective. So it's been going for about 14 years, and the program's entirely online. A lot of fun, great students, mid-career people wanting to grow and progress and learn how to deal with all the kinds of stuff that we talk about. So great to work with them over a few year period and see them really grow and develop. The second thing is that I'm the co-founder of an entity called the Global Negotiation Initiative, which is based at the Harvard Negotiation Project with William Ury, and we work on a lot of international negotiation efforts, as well as developing materials, trainings, all that kind of fun stuff. And one of the things that I'm involved in with him that's really quite exciting is a group called the Possibilists, which is about 40 people from around the world right now and growing, of people who are working on conflicts around the world, who are supporting each other, helping each other to grow, to work on problems and challenges and things along those lines. So really great. And in fact, one of the people that's involved in that effort is a documentary filmmaker who actually just released an episode on Al Jazeera about the Possibilist group, and with a focus on William. So hopefully your listeners will tune into that. It's a wonderful 30-minute episode of him talking about the conflicts he's worked on, and then talking about the group and things along those lines. So really fascinating and fun stuff. And to be very honest, it's really terrific to have people like that to sort of work with and rely on. Sometimes I think for those of us who are working in this world, it can get a little lonely and you can feel a little siloed. And so that network and that support is really terrific. And then the last bit of this is that I have my own consulting company. So I do a lot of work with governments, for-profits, nonprofits, hospitals, you name it. Any place where there's negotiation, conflict, and leadership challenges, pretty much working. And it's great. I really enjoy it. It challenges me to figure out how to help people in these different realms to learn and grow and develop. In terms of my own work, I love to write when I have something to say. I'm in a very fortunate position where I'm not pushed by my universities and things like that to write, so I can do it when I have something to say there. And so that's great. But also getting involved in a lot of real world situations, doing a lot of mediating. My sort of advising and coaching work has really grown a lot in the last few years. And it's really quite fun because it's real world challenges and trying to help somebody to navigate through their negotiations and difficult conflicts. So that's, sort of it in a nutshell. And it's busy, but it's, like you, Tony, it's a labor of love. I was meeting with somebody the other day and they said, "So when are you going to retire?" And I said, "You don't retire from your life because this is my life.
Right.
This is what I do." Right. So it's great. And I wouldn't change a thing.
Do it's so wonderful to hear this, but I have heard this from almost every single one of my guests in this arena, because there's this real sense that you're adding value. There's a real sense that you're making a difference. Every conversation you have actually makes a difference, changes somebody's perspective, or even changes your perspective. But in one way or another, it changes a dynamic. Mike Inman, who I know you know very well, I met him in Denver, and he said to me, "I hope I die doing what I do now." And I think that's a beautiful sentiment to echo. Right, what we're doing really makes a difference.
It does. And, the interesting thing for me is, conflict is so ubiquitous and people really, really struggle with it. And so when you help them to have some ideas about how to go about dealing with something that's really weighing on them, and me too, like I've seen in my own life where I've had some challenging conflicts, and to feel the pressure and the potential damage to relationships and things like that, and to be able to find a way through them, it's a gift. It really is, and I think it's a gift that we can give to the world. And I hope we can give it to a lot more people, because I know people struggle with this on a regular basis.
Do you think there are more conflicts now than ever before, or is it just the fact that we're in this world and we're maybe in an echo chamber of just dealing with conflict?
I think it's the latter. I think there's more high profile things that are happening obviously right now from a conflict related perspective. But if you look back, this is the norm of history. I think the question is, it felt to me like for a 40, 50, 60-year period, we were getting better and better at managing this. And I think in the end, right, conflicts aren't going to stop. It becomes a question of, how do you handle it? And if it's handled productively, where you can find a solution that, emboldens people and gives them a way in which you can meet your needs and things like that, then, right, that's what's important. The problem is we have too much destructive conflict where people don't know how to handle it. So what do people do when that's the case? They revert back to their instincts, and our instincts when it comes to conflict are not helpful, because we're all about defending ourselves, right? That's, back to the hunter-gatherer days. If we didn't defend ourselves, we got eaten, which is not a prospect that anybody wants, right? But I think the reality is that if you get stuck in your instinctual mode of either fight or flight, it's very hard to get creative. It's very hard to be productive in terms of how you handle a situation. And so what we do is we dig in and we don't get very far, and things harden and things go from bad to worse. So I think it really is a lack of knowledge and skills and understanding that this is the kind of thing that you can learn to handle effectively, but you've got to understand that reality. And a lot of times people will say to me when they come to a training that I do or something, like, "I never thought you could actually really learn a way of handling conflict," which I find really interesting.
Yeah, well, one thing I want to state at this point for any new listeners is this idea that when you hear about the word negotiation, a lot of people consider it to be either sales, procurement, contracting, and that kind of stuff. And you'll know on LinkedIn there's a whole body of people who equate negotiation with sales and revenue.
Mhm.
And I think that's a very important vertical of negotiation. Uh, would you maybe share with us your view on the different verticals within the world of negotiation and some of the differences that may exist between them?
Well, the thing is that for me, when it comes to, say, for example, negotiation, I mean, I think we use negotiation for three purposes, is sort of the way that I like to think of it. The first one is to create deals, right? That you and I
Yeah,
have
yeah,
business opportunities, right? That one's pretty self-explanatory. I think the other two are a little less self-explanatory. One, to me, is actually to build relationships, because if you use negotiation to build relationships, what does it do? It creates a level of trust and an ability to work with people in a productive manner. And so, anytime I'm negotiating, I'm always thinking about what's my short-term goal, right? But how do I develop this long-term relationship so that I can be engaging with this person over time, and it's in my interest to do that. There's reasons why I want to do that, etc. Right? And the relationship is something that I can see that is important to build, because at some point we're going to need each other, right? And it was interesting because one of my daughters said to me, "You've done okay in life. Like, what do you attribute that to?" And I said, honestly, I understand the power of and the nature of relationships and how important they are. And so it's a longer term kind of notion that I don't think people, would sort of connect to negotiation. But to me, it's a very important part of negotiation. And in and of itself, like if you go into a negotiation and perhaps you don't meet your short term goals, but you've built the relationship to come back around, there's something to be said about that, and to be thinking that that's success, because we need those relationships into the future.
yeah,
And the
yeah,
third way in which I use negotiation really is to handle difficult conversations and conflicts. And people say, well, what's the difference? And I think sometimes I find that when you're talking about dealing with conflict, it's about going to another level down and deeper in, because there are often things when we're talking about dealing with a conflict that are identity based, or that cut to the what I would call the intangible realm, the things that make us human. Those things exist in negotiation as well, but they're more frequently the drivers in conflict. So I think when you're thinking about negotiation, and if you can think about it in those three ways, you realize that you're doing it all the time, right? At work, if I'm trying to work on a project and I've got to lead a project with people, um, I'm negotiating. The minute somebody says, I don't agree with your vision for this, right? Well, now we're
yeah,
negotiating.
very
And
much.
so I think and what I try to help people to understand is that most of their negotiations are informal. They're not at a table or in an office. They're, sitting in a coffee shop, and they're talking about things over at lunch with colleagues or whatever it might be. And I think the more people can grasp that, the more they realize this is a fundamental knowledge set and skill base.
It's so when you say it like that, and I totally agree. By the way, is it sounds a bit of an oxymoron then, right? If you practice something, if you do it over and over again, then by virtue of the fact that you're repeating it, it becomes a habit. You should become better and better. You should become good at it.
Mm,
We negotiate every day, all the time, every day, but still, a majority of people, when it comes to negotiation, aren't always getting optimal results. Why do you
right.
think that is?
Well, and this is something that I address in my book that you and I talked about getting back to the table and sort of learning from negotiation failures and setbacks. I think there's a couple of reasons why people don't, always get better and better. First, there was a great quote by a woman named Catherine Bartol, who is a business professor at University of Maryland. And she said, when you've seen one negotiation, you've seen one negotiation. And
Yeah.
what I love about that is she's trying to help people to sort of grasp the notion that even though negotiations look very similar and have a lot of dynamics that are quite the same, um, each negotiation has a different dimension to it that makes it a little bit unique. And I think that leads into why we aren't don't always continue to grow and have success, because what we tend to do is we have an approach, like anything in life, right? When we do things, we have an approach, and if it works, we want to stick with it because there's a level of comfort to it. We develop what are often called heuristics, like mental shortcuts, right? And so the problem is that if we've had success in a negotiation, we always want to go back to how did we do it there and transfer it to the future. But there are dynamics and other kinds of things that are very different from one negotiation to another. And so those mental shortcuts get in the way sometimes and are not actually too helpful. And as a result, we find ourselves stuck. We don't learn about for example, all of the dynamics that impact negotiation, like power and trust and time. And we don't think about those things, but those are the things that make every negotiation unique and that can throw us off. And I think the other reason is that we can struggle at times and not always have success. I mean, some of it, of course, has to do with the other people involved. Negotiation is not fully in our control, as we well know, right? When we make decisions, the other person's going to react and respond. So it's not just my decision, it's an interdependent process. But the other part to this that I think is fundamental, and what I've been working with people more and more, is to help them to learn to be flexible and adaptable with their approach to negotiation. Because as you well know, Tony, we're always working with incomplete information. And as a result, we have to be prepared for the unexpected, that people are going to say things that we don't know and that we didn't even realize were part of a negotiation. And then what do we do with that? That's when most people freak out. That's when they will give concessions or, do things they shouldn't because they're unprepared for those things to come. And the thing is, you can't prepare for those unexpecteds. What you can do is train your mind to say, I know that when I go through this negotiation, this other person or people are very likely to say some things and bring up issues that I hadn't considered. And so when that happens, I am prepared to manage that. That's a key, and I think one that people don't tend to think a lot about. But I've been weaving that in, and it's interesting because I had a very good friend named Izzy Gazelle, and he passed away recently. But Izzy was an improv trainer, and he would teach people in the skills of improv comedy. And improv comedy is all about flexibility and adaptability and learning to be in the moment. And so I learned a lot from him about that notion. And when you're present and you're not making assumptions and you're not already way ahead of the other negotiator, you can take in that information in a much better way and actually find creative solutions that way.
Yeah, Josh, when I tell people what I do and that I'm fascinated by the world of negotiation, people, their eyes tend to glaze over and go cross-eyed and think that, we're just geeks, we're crazy kind of people. How would you convince the audience that you're just a regular guy?
Well, first of all, sometimes I get a similar reaction, but more often than not, I get the really, I didn't know that you could study that kind of thing. Look, we are geeks, but geeks are necessary to advance things and to help people to understand that there's a way of thinking about this process, this approach that is so important. And we're going to help you to do that. I mean, look, I am, very much a sports person. I'm out constantly playing, watching, doing. My kids would tell you that I am a kid at heart. And so I'm always looking to have fun. So there's always going to be a geeky side to people, presumably who are part of academia and part of growing and developing a field. But but there's a lot of fun to be had. For example, a few years ago with your friend Kel Jensen, we did a Zoom session on Ted Lasso and negotiation lessons from the Ted Lasso series. And somebody might say, well, that's a little geeky, but it was really fun. And we actually were able to tease out a lot of great scenarios from the show that were very poignant from a negotiation point of view. Now, again, maybe I just reinforced my geekiness. I don't know. But I think, a show like that, I mean, it's a brilliant show, because it addresses, you know, the realities. And I think honestly, what we have not done well as a field is we have not helped the world to understand how interesting, how difficult, and how fascinating it is, the kinds of challenges that we try to
Yeah,
manage.
yeah.
And I think we have to get better at that, and try to put more and more things out in the public sphere where we're helping people to do that. And we
I
are
really
getting
like.
there, but it takes a while. And I actually wrote a TV script, of a show, focused on sort of building off of real world peace processes, but it's fictitious in nature. So I could add in dimensions and things along those lines. And I'm in the process of trying to get it in front of some people to see what happens. But I think I saw what happened, for example, when the show The West Wing came out, and it changed a lot of how people
Yeah.
thought about and understood politics. And I think if we could land a show like that related to negotiation and dealing with conflict, I think it would really help people to understand the kinds of things we do and the nuances that are involved, because it's so challenging, as well. And you've had all amazing guests who can talk about this, in ways that are really amazing. And so, my hope is by being able to pull some of those stories through that, um, that people will come away saying, huh, we should really be giving diplomacy and negotiation more of a chance. And perhaps the people who are putting their necks on the line on a daily basis, we should have a different view of them, a view of not all heroes wear capes, right?
I love it. Love that. Um, so I've got a real life case that I want to share with you, and I really like your perspective on this. So I was in a meeting yesterday with a group of leaders, and one of them said at the beginning of the meeting, right, here we need to be brutally honest with each other. And before the meeting even began, there was this huge debate about what does brutally honest mean, right? Um, and it kind of disintegrated with one person saying, okay, well, if you don't want me to be brutally honest, then I'll play the game and I just won't say anything. And I kind of didn't say much at the time. The only comment I made was, I said, well, I think it's important that we are honest. I don't know about the brutal side, but I think it's important that we're honest. And if you have something that you want to say to me that's really important, then 50% of the responsibility of how you create that message lies with you. You've got to figure out how best is it for Tony to receive the message. So is it important for you to say what you have to say, or is it important for Tony to hear what needs to be heard? And if you think about that, then you'll put some effort into how you convey the message. And then the feedback I got was, well, if you need to develop tougher skin, if you can't handle being told the brutal truth, then maybe you need to be. No, it wasn't directed to me personally, but this is what came out from
Yeah.
the group.
Yeah.
And so I just thought I'd sit back. I knew I was talking to you today, so I thought, well, I won't say anything. I'll gather the info, and then we'll chop this up together. I'd love to hear your views on that.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, I mean, it's interesting because the first question that comes to mind to me is a cultural one, because in certain places, being direct and brutally honest, if you will, if I can put that in air quotes, right, would be an acceptable way of communicating, and in a lot of places it's not, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think that's the first thing. The second question or the second thought that comes to mind is, and I'm going to sort of bring through the gendered conversation here, was this a room of men and women? Men, what?
Majority men,
Yeah,
80% men. Yeah.
right. Because that sounds like a very male conversation. When
Mhm.
someone says that you can't handle being brutally honest, then right, that's more likely a sort of a tough guy male persona that's being pushed forward. I think just so to your point, I think you're exactly right to highlight the notion of why are we talking about the idea of brutally honest? Like, honesty is critically important. And I say to people, look, in negotiation, you cannot be an effective negotiator. You cannot handle conflict effectively if you don't assert for yourself. Right.
Yes.
But there's
Yes.
a difference between assertiveness and aggressiveness. And when you start saying brutally honest, it feels like you're crossing the line. And my colleague, William Ury, likes to explain the idea of assertive and aggressive this way. So if you're assertive, you're standing on your own 2 feet. If you're aggressive, you're standing on someone else's toes. And for me,
Nice.
right, it's a great way to think of it and a great way to highlight it. And in my mind, I think the problem with a brutally honest conversation is it's going to leak over into aggressiveness. And I think if you could say to them, hey, like, here's this distinction. I'm all for the former. I'm not for the latter. And it's back to your point, Tony, which is if you're going to deliver a message, sir, how are you going to do that? Have you thought about it? Not just the what you want to say, but how you want to say it. Because in the end, if you're not going to frame it well, then of course I'm going to be triggered by that. So the onus is on you to think about how am I going to deliver this message? And part of it is on me on how I'm going to take it in, right? So I think words matter. And I think in your case, I would have done exactly the same thing and said, well, tell me what you mean by brutally honest. And like a lot of times people will say, like when I talk to them in a training, for example, about dealing with conflict, and they will say to me, I don't want to confront the other. And I say, did I ever tell you to confront them? Because confrontation means this. It means butting heads, right? I told you to have a conversation with them, a discussion. That's different. Every negotiation, every conversation we have is framed in a certain way, right? And so what you were taking issue with was the framing of let's have a brutally honest conversation. And there's a bunch of ways that you could have framed that differently. Like, let's be direct and honest when we feel like we need to, but let's also recognize that we're going to say something to somebody. And so we should be thinking, how can I communicate that as best as possible? But the other thing goes to the underlying culture. So was this a certain organization?
No, it was a group of individual founders.
Okay. So I just wonder whether there's sort of an underlying culture here of people not being honest, right? That somebody said that because they feel like people are not being honest in this situation.
Correct.
In this
Absolutely.
group, right?
Yeah.
So the question is, how do you get people to be honest without being offensive? Right? People often say you can disagree without being disagreeable. And I think that's what you're looking for, and that's what you want. And it's not going to be that productive of a conversation if people just feel like, oh, well, I have the license to say whatever I want in whatever way I want. Well, no, you don't. Right? And I think that's what you're getting at. And so it's a process point, but I think it's an important one because, one of the things that I've learned, Tony, and I'm guessing you have as well, is a lot of this is about expectations. And I think somebody there was trying to set an expectation of let's have the hard, difficult conversations. But again, we're back to not choosing our language carefully, right? If they had just said, let's be very honest with each other, nobody would have blinked an eye, right? But when you say, let's be brutally honest with each other, that means I'm going to tell you, Tony, potentially all the things that I don't like about you. Why? What's the purpose? Like, what are you trying to accomplish with that? It's a little bit like in the book, I talk about how people often will fall back on blame. I'm like, blame does not serve any purpose.
Yeah.
Right? It just simply doesn't. And so if you want to sit here and have a conversation about whose fault this is, I'm not sure why we're doing that. If you want to have a conversation about whose responsibility is this and why we weren't accountable in a certain instance or why we should have been accountable, that's different, right? And that's an important conversation to have. Yeah. So I guess what I would say to you, and I think if I was facilitating that, is like, let's use our words carefully here and think about what is it that you're truly trying to convey to the folks sitting around this table, because you're trying to set up a conversation in a certain way. That's what's happening, right?
You and I both know here, Josh, that the best way we can convey our points or share our ideas and perspectives is through stories. And this is what really piqued my interest in your new project. I really want to see if we can do a deep dive into that. Can you maybe frame that for us and share with us first, what was the idea? It's the Negotiation Stories project, right? What was the idea behind it? What are you trying to achieve? And more importantly, how can we kind of get involved and try and help out?
First of all, this is an open invitation to everybody who's listening to get involved. Um, what I'm attempting to honestly achieve is a bit of an experiment. And so I have no idea where it's going to go or what it's going to happen. But let me let me rewind for 1 second. So I'm a big believer, and I have been for quite a long time, that stories are, of course, they're universal, right? So everybody understands a story. If I start by saying, Tony, let me tell you a story, immediately there's something that changes in you, right? Like your interest is piqued, right? Um, and what I noticed as I've been negotiating, mediating, and working in conflicts is that stories are incredibly powerful. Um, my colleague William Ury, who I've mentioned before, um, gave me a quote for the site, and I'd love to just share it. It's such a good one, and it says, "There's an old saying that some conflicts that are so difficult, only a story can transform them."
Mm.
And he was saying, and he said that's the great value of what you're doing with this project is that you're creating an open invitation to people to come and share their negotiation stories that they've experienced over their lives. So the idea is to kind of open, the tent in all directions, if I can borrow from Abraham, right? And welcome in the global negotiation community and say, we all have stories that we've experienced as a result of doing this work. And I would love to have people share those stories in a place where others can learn from them, others can comment on them, um, and people can feel validated about their experiences, whether those negotiations were successes, failures, or something in between. And honestly, what's been really interesting. So I launched the site in mid-April. We have over 150 people who have now joined, which is really great. And people are sharing their stories of negotiations that they've had over the years. And for example, there was a really great one where somebody shared that they had been an employee who's actually a chemist, and was asked to do a lot of extra work. Somebody got fired, and they kind of just transferred all of the work from that one person to this guy. And he of course felt like, hey, that's unfair. And sadly, a lot of organizations do this and don't compensate
Yeah.
people when that's the case. But he went back to them and said, listen, I'm not going to do this. It's not fair to me. And he began to cultivate a BATNA. He said, if you are willing to compensate me, okay, then let's negotiate that. But if not, I need you to understand that, like, I'm not just going to do this going forward. And excuse me. So anyways, what ended up happening is, at first they were like, we're not going to compensate you at all. And so he's like, well, okay, so I'm going to explore my BATNA. And he ultimately developed a really good BATNA. And just as he was about to leave, and he was pretty indispensable as part of this team, which it seems like the company only realized toward the end of all of this. But basically he went to HR and they said, look, tell us what you want to stay. And he said, listen, I gave you guys an opportunity. You pushed it aside and you only took it seriously when I had a legitimate alternative. And he ended up leaving as a result. He said, the whole experience soured his perspective on what had happened and things like that. Now, again, some people might look at that and say that's a failed negotiation. To me, it's not,
Right.
because he met his objective, right? He was undervalued at his current company, and so he did something about it. What was interesting is that 3 or 4 people commented about that on the site. One person saying, he should have been more of a team player. He should have done what what he was asking him. Others saying, well, yeah, but the company was also treating him unfairly, and they only decided to compensate him or to do something when they were pushed. And do you really want to work for a company like that, right? It's that kind of a conversation that comes out of a story like that I think is really productive for us all to learn from and to kind of grow from. So I'm increasingly hoping that people will jump in and, they can share their stories through videos. You can do it through YouTube, which then you can load in, or you can, type in your story, etc. And, my goal really was to create a place where people could share their stories because, and I'm sure this is the case for you, Tony, like when I go to parties or I'm out at a social event and I tell people what to do, they say, "Oh, I have a great story to tell you."
Yeah.
Almost always,
Yeah.
right? And the thing is for me, and when I first started working at Harvard in 1995, I was um, asked to come to faculty dinners and like record what was happening and things like that. And what was fascinating about it is people were sharing, there'd be 25 people, faculty and others there, and they'd be sharing stories and examples of negotiations that they'd been involved in. And it was fascinating. And I kept thinking, why are we not telling these stories to the rest of the world? Like people need to hear this so that they
Mm.
understand how to effectively negotiate, because there's so many mythologies out there about what effective negotiation is, right? That get in the way and that don't serve people's purpose at all. So this is an attempt to say, like, come and share your experiences and have the community sort of validate that and to talk about it and to pull out lessons and say, did you consider this? And what did you really learn from that? I feel like sometimes when people
Mm.
have experiences, they don't really learn. They think they do, but they don't really deeply examine what happened in a situation. And so my hope was that if people put these things out there, not only would people learn from them, but it would force everybody to sort of go deeper in understanding what might have happened and things along those lines.
Mm. You've said it twice. You've talked in the past, like my hope was, my idea was.
Mm.
I mean, it still is, right? Your hope is you're still. Are you still
Yes, yes.
positive about this? Okay, right, right,
Yeah,
right.
and in fact, the European Negotiation Association, which I joined last year, has joined in as a partner. I have
Super.
a couple other partners that are coming online. And, for example, like with students, I know students have wonderful stories about their
Yeah,
experiences. And
yeah,
I'm hoping that, we can put this in front of people, let them know about it, and then have people share and who knows what will come of it. But the thing is, I mean, and it's funny because somebody said, well, what's the point? And I said, the point is the story.
right,
It's
right.
there has to be something much deeper than that. When people share these stories, and there's some really interesting research. There's a number of folks at Stanford who have done quite a bit of research on storytelling. And what they talk about is that stories are way easier to remember when you're in a difficult situation, right? So you can recall a story differently than a theory or a concept. But what's also really interesting is when you tell a story, the reader, even though it had nothing to do with them, they can find themselves in the story,
Absolutely,
which is
absolutely.
fascinating, right? Like that's a really interesting psychological dimension to us, which
Yeah,
is that it makes people receptive, and it even sort of puts them in a mindset of thinking, yeah, I could imagine myself in that, right? And that's
yeah,
where I've
yeah.
actually found this incredibly helpful in negotiation, because if you say something that I really disagree with and I push back, chances are we're not going to get very far. But if you say something and I say, you know what, let me share an experience or let me share a story with you where I dealt with something similar and maybe we can use that as a jumping off point,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
All of a sudden, we've now changed the conversation and you and I are engaged in a story. And there's a power to that we've all seen. And I think what I'm trying to do is get people to put their finger on it and really sort of dive in and share uh, you know, these things that have happened to them and maybe to help them think differently about what they could have done for the future so they grow and learn. But also, I think it's helpful for the reader. I've encouraged people, look, if you don't want to share a story, that's okay. Just come and lurk and learn from, what people are posting.
So, the first thing that springs to mind when we talk about stories is,
Mhm.
one thing is to have a story to tell. The other thing is to know how to tell the story, right? How to communicate that story effectively so that you can bring
Yeah.
people along with you and that they can see themselves in that story. How are you curating the way in which these stories are communicated?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. So, I have a good friend named Bruce Feiler. I don't know if you've ever heard that name, but Bruce is a wonderful guy. If there are people out there, he's a terrific author. He's written many, many best-selling New York Times books. The way I got to know him was through a project I've been involved in for a long time called the Abraham Path, and he wrote a book called Abraham, and was looking at whether Abraham could be used as as a way of uniting the three monotheistic faiths. But he also wrote a book called Walking the Bible, where he walked the modern day Bible, and they turned it into a documentary series and things like that. And I bring Bruce up because he created a platform. So Bruce had cancer, and he ended up creating a circle of people that he relied on to help him through that and things like that. And then he wrote a book after called The Dad Circle, things like that. And the platform is really a storytelling platform of, encouraging people to come and share their own experiences. So I reached out to Bruce, and he said exactly what you said. He's like, it's one thing to create a site, it's another to help people to tell a good story.
Right, right.
So I've actually I have a sort of a 30-second video on the site where I say, look, if you're a little unsure how to tell a story, here are a few different components. And one of which is to try to think more about the emotional tone of it. And how do I put this in front of people in a way that's relatable, right? So that people can really grasp what we're talking about. But also the idea is also to kind of put it out there in a way that people can understand and relate to. If I share a story that people can imagine having experienced, then, right, they're going to relate to it much more clearly. That's why, like in negotiation, when I share a story, I'm always doing it because I have a sense that whatever the moral of the story is going to land differently and resonate differently with the other negotiator, right?
Fantastic.
So it's each of those that sort of help people to kind of come in and think about, how can I best tell this story? What am I really trying to get across by telling the story? I think that's the big one is, I remember one of going, maybe this is geeky, maybe this makes me normal, but one of my favorite comedy movies is Planes, Trains, and Automobiles. And Steve Martin and John Candy star in it, and it's a hilarious movie. And at one point, John Candy tells a story and it has no meaning whatsoever. And Steve Martin says, when you tell a story, you should have a point. You should have meaning in it. And of course it was sarcastic and funny, but like, it's true that, we've all had people, we listen to their stories and we're like, not really sure what you're trying to get at here.
Right. Yeah.
So like always start with, what am I trying, like what's the end goal? What am I trying to convey? And why do I think that that's going to be helpful? And when I work with people to coach them in negotiation, I will say, you're going into this situation. Can you think of any previous examples or precedents that you can bring with you into the room that you could have prepared in case something like this comes up, in case you meet resistance? And so that can be really valuable to go into a negotiation, generally with, negotiations that look somewhat similar to this, right? And maybe you've got 2 or 3 stories that you could share along the way. It's a really useful tool in your toolbox.
Yeah, one of the things that I really love about this project and your approach is it falls in line with what I've been working on doing, which is this idea of democratizing negotiation, right? You want negotiators are not just people in executive suites negotiating deals or in big plush offices negotiating land deals and things like this. We negotiate every single day, and I think this work, what appeals to me is that it shows that kids are going to be negotiating, parents negotiate with kids, with each other, and it really just opens the door to the fact that yes, we do this every day. It's an everyday pursuit, and it's a skill. And the more you do it, the more you practice it, the better you get. And then when you realize that there's also a third-party perspective to it, because I mean, we haven't touched on it. We touched on it briefly in this conversation when you talked about identity. I'm pretty confident I negotiate because the way I do, in part because of the way I saw my parents negotiating with each other and negotiating with their way through life. I'm pretty confident that if I dug deep enough, I would find some similarities there, and then with their parents and so on. And so this opening that door, opening the window on something that we do every single day. And then we can get better at it. We don't have to do it a specific way just because it's always been done. I think is a really, really great project to get involved with. So, I mean, what's the deal? I mean, how do people get
Yeah.
involved? What are you looking for other than just jumping on and sharing
Yeah.
stories?
It's super simple, really. Like you said, it's negotiationstories.net. You go, you register. You just got to sign up. It's free, and then you go into the community members portal, and you can read through the number of stories that are already there, and then you can post. And if I mean, I guess I'm asking people to be a little bit courageous, and maybe the word courage might strike people as a bit odd, but to put yourself out
Yeah,
there in
yeah,
that way does require a little courage. But you're helping not only yourself to grow and to learn, but and in a very organic way, right? You never know like what kind of comments you're going to get back from people when you
yeah,
share a
yeah.
story and things along those lines. Um, but the idea is really to put things out there and see what happens, and to try to encourage more and more people to share, so that. And I love the phraseology that you just used, democratize negotiation, because I think that's exactly right. That people need to understand they are doing this all the time, and there's a
Mm,
tremendous amount to learn from each other. And that's what the idea is. That not everything has to be through a book. Not everything has to be through a specific experience in that moment. Like when people post and say, I had this experience, what do people think? Um, it's a great opportunity to be like, oh, okay, so other people are also having this experience, having this uh, way of approaching things, and maybe they're not always certain. And it's very interesting. Like when I've been doing keynotes on my book about failure, and I share some of my negotiation failures, I've had people come up to me and say, I was really surprised that you would do that. And I say, why? They're like, well, you're at Harvard. I'm like, that doesn't mean anything. Like, you don't think I fail? Like, I fail all the time. Like most of us do, because if you're working on difficult negotiations, you fail. Like, that is how it works. And so we can hide that, or we can put it out there and say, what did I miss? What did I get wrong? So that we can all grow and learn from each other's, challenges, but also, and again, also successes. There's some great creative thinking out there that people engage in. Um, and I think when people learn about that, they're like, oh, that's really great. Like, so I don't necessarily have to compromise. Like, if I was thinking more creatively about this, I could have found a better solution. Exactly. Right. So it's a, in some ways, hopefully it's a easy and somewhat comfortable way to kind of put some ideas out there and see what happens. And I would encourage people, like I said, if you're not comfortable sharing right away, come in and see what other people have written. And there is a way to share anonymously if you feel more comfortable doing that. That's okay. Like, what's important is to put these out there and to say, here's what happened, and here's what I took away, and here's what I think other people can learn from it. And you know I wrote a book 5 years ago, 6 years ago now, called The Book of Real World Negotiations. And it's these case studies of actual negotiations from around the world. And the reason I mention that is because what's been great about it is people will say to me, I read your book, really interesting, blah, blah, blah. But, and I finish each chapter after each case with some of the lessons that I saw from that situation.
mm.
And people will come to me and say, great, loved how you pulled out lessons, but you missed one. I'm like, great. Like, what is it? Right? It's that kind of thing that I'm hoping people will do here, but in a much broader kind of way.
I'm glad you just mentioned that book. I didn't know you'd written that book, but that's I've been looking for a book
Uh-huh.
for on real world negotiations, because I tend to find, I mean, I did the Harvard program on negotiation. I was there maybe about 3 years ago, maybe about 5 or 6 years ago. Um, yeah. So I teach at a business school, and I look at the business cases that are used. And some of them are we're still talking about Nike, the deal with Michael Jordan and Nike, or the deal with Apple and Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. And so I've always been on the lookout for real world, what's happening like now, the negotiations, everyday negotiations that you can pull in and then show examples. So this for me, that's the first book I'm rushing out to get after this call. That's for sure.
Well, and
Uh,
what's fun about it was that, so there's domestic, like U.S. domestic business cases, there's international business cases, which are interesting. There's peace process negotiations in there. And then there's also 5 hostage crisis negotiations.
Ah, okay.
And what's really interesting about those is people are like, yeah, what am I going to learn from a crisis negotiation? I'm like, read it and tell me. And they're like, wow, I actually learned a lot from, reading these hostage and crisis negotiations and how those guys go about building rapport and things like that. So there's a transferability. And when I wrote the book, part of what I was trying to do was, yeah, write this for people who do training and things like that. But also I wanted people to be able to pick the book up and go, so what does effective negotiation look like? I'm not going to tell you, I'm going to show you. And that's what
Excellent.
the cases are about, right?
Excellent.
And I think, I've found that people are like, okay, this is really, it's not what I thought great negotiation was, but I'm beginning to see it differently. And that's the idea. And again, we're back to stories, right? Those stories, those cases are just extended stories that let people in a way and say, tell us what you think about this. You're reading it, make sense of it.
Josh, we are coming to the end, unfortunately, but there is something, it's more of a comment, and I want to invite you to comment on an observation. During this conversation, you mentioned how one thing is looking at the substance of a negotiation, the processes, but you also mentioned about what happens when there's no trust. What happens when there's other areas like you might feel angry, resentment, all this kind of stuff. You might feel maybe you're bringing in some baggage from before, or you might be depressed, but that's going to control how you show up in the negotiation. And 10 years ago, I don't think I would be talking to a Harvard professor in negotiation about the role that emotions play in negotiation. It was very much, a pragmatic approach to how we negotiate. Comments on how things have changed. Have you noticed that there's more now of an acceptance that our emotions play a direct role on the outcome of our negotiations?
So I'll just speak about it a little bit from the point of view of the U.S. Not that I don't work internationally, but a lot of the training I do is U.S. based. And what's interesting is that when I talk to people in trainings about this, it always comes back to this idea of people will say, you're not acting professionally if you allow your emotions to be part of the process. So that's been the common notion here for a very long time, is that somehow if our emotions come to the table, we're being unprofessional.
Right.
I push back very hard on that notion. Human beings are logical and emotional creatures. That's who we are. I mean, and whether your emotions are expressed or not doesn't matter. They're there. If you're angry, you're angry. I do think, and having had some conversations with William Ury about this, one of the authors of Getting to Yes, right? He says, in hindsight, absolutely, like the emotional piece of this has evolved in a way that is productive, and that we have to be taking this all in. And I think there was, the great book by Roger Fisher and Dan Shapiro called Beyond Reason, that really took this all in and said, look, emotions are going to play a role here. The question is, what do you do with them? And how do you manage? I often say to people in my trainings, like, look, we have 4 hours. I don't have time to teach you to be emotionally intelligent, but you need to invest in that for your life and your career. It is a core part of negotiation. It's the part that, as one of my students said, if we could just do away with emotions, this would all be a lot easier. And of course, that's true. And I'm like, and we can't. So then it becomes a question of, can you work on yourself to deal with the emotional components of your negotiations? Because that's the essence of it. That's what's required. And if you choose not to, you will fail. Your emotions will overwhelm you. You won't manage them effectively, and you won't be able to recognize them in others as well. And so it's a core skill set, like anything. And anybody who says, we have to just keep this at a rational sort of level, that train has left the station. It is no longer how we do this. And my stake is firmly planted on the ground on that one, that if you're not listening to the emotions, I mean, Sigmund Freud had an amazing quote. I wish I could remember exactly what he said, but it's along the lines of unexpressed emotions do not die. They just sit there, they linger, they continue to influence how you do things. So it's back to your point about, your parents. And I agree totally. Like with my parents, it was very much like when my parents would have a significant conflict, my dad would get in the car and drive away.
Mm.
And I used to say to them, well, how did that work? And my dad, he would say, well, I always would come back and deal with it later. And my mother would look at him like, not always.
Yeah.
Right? So I think it's just, you have to develop techniques to manage the emotional piece of it, right? None of us handle that well. So we have to, go to the balcony, do deep breathing, these kinds of things that sound like, oh God, how new agey, but it's not new agey. It's human beings. Like when you take deep breaths, it changes the physiology in your body, right? It's science. It's not us saying that. So to answer your question, it's a critical component of negotiation. It's not going anywhere. And if you think you can do this without becoming emotionally intelligent, you're sorely mistaken. I hate to tell you. How's that for a summary?
I mean, if we were on stage, I think you'd be dropping the mic right now. That's a mic drop.
Right.
Boom. Well, Josh, I'd like to thank you very much for joining us. It's been absolutely enthralling, this conversation. I'm going to look you up. I'll send you a separate email because, as I said, I will be in Boston in September, and so I'm really hoping that you're going to be available and we can catch up.
I've got a trip to Europe, but hopefully it'll be in and around there. So.
Okay. Well, where in Europe?
I'm going to be in Ireland for about 10 days,
Okay.
working on the Abraham Path and that Possibilist group that I mentioned.
Okay. Well, let's see. If the negotiation gods want us to meet, it will happen.
If not, you're in Malta, right?
I'm in Barcelona.
Oh, you're in Barcelona?
Yeah.
I was actually just there on a family vacation.
No way.
I should have looked you up. I will be back though, as well in October. So,
Okay.
So maybe we can catch up then.
Super. Well, thank you for joining us, and for guests listening, all the details will be in the show notes. But really, make sure you do check out the stories, the Negotiation Stories project. It sounds like an incredible project, bringing people from all walks of life into the world of negotiation to have better conversations, so we can live better quality lives. Thank you for joining us on Empathy at the Table. Thank you, Josh.
Thanks, Tony. My pleasure. It was great to be with you.